The night was quiet, and the village slept under a blanket of stars. The wind whispered through the trees, and the children lay dreaming in their beds, unaware that the sky above them was about to change forever. A soft hum began to rise in the darkness, faint at first like the distant song of some unseen creature, and then growing louder and louder until it vibrated through the walls and the earth beneath them. Suddenly, a brilliant light tore across the sky, so bright it made the stars blink and vanish, leaving a trail of silver fire that lit up every rooftop in the village. The children awoke, one by one, blinking against the unnatural glow, their hearts beating fast as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The light grew closer, and a massive spacecraft descended from the heavens, its hull shimmering with colors that no human eye had ever seen. Shapes moved across the surface like living patterns, and the air was filled with a hum that seemed to speak directly to their minds. The four children froze as a beam of soft blue light reached down from the ship, touching the ground, where they had been sleeping before, lifting them gently, as if they weighed nothing at all. Their feet left the earth, and a strange feeling of weightlessness filled them, terror and awe mingling in their chests. They tried to scream, but no sound came from their mouths, only the sound of their own rapid heartbeats and the deep hum of the alien vessel. They glanced at each other and saw wide eyes reflecting the same fear and disbelief, every thought of home and safety slipping further away. The ship moved silently into the sky, faster than anything they had ever imagined, leaving behind only the glowing marks where the beam had touched the earth. The village lights flickered, as if uncertain whether to remain on or off, and the wind carried a faint echo of the hum that would haunt their dreams for nights to come. Inside the spacecraft, the children were set gently on a platform, surrounded by walls that pulsed with soft light. The air smelled strange and metallic, but not unpleasant, and the sound of the hum seemed to calm their racing hearts. Just a little shadows moved along the walls, and shapes flickered in the corners, like creatures made of light and mist. The Galactic King appeared then, standing taller than any man they had ever seen, his robes flowing like liquid starlight, his face pale and sharp, with eyes that seemed to hold both curiosity and ancient knowledge. He regarded the children silently for a long moment, and the children felt as if their souls were being weighed. They did not understand why they had been taken, only that something far larger than themselves had begun. Their minds raced with questions. Could their parents find them? Would they ever return home? What was this place, and why had the stars themselves chosen this night to reach down and touch their lives? As the Galactic King extended a hand toward them, a soft glow enveloped the children, and the hum intensified, filling their minds with visions of worlds they had never seen, seas of colors, skies of impossible shapes, and creatures that spoke without sound. The fear that had gripped them began to mix with wonder, and even a tiny spark of excitement for what lay ahead, as the ship rose higher and higher, leaving Earth behind, and the children realized that their lives had changed forever. The children blinked against the sudden brightness, as the spacecraft's interior revealed a vast palace that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The walls shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting colors that danced and shifted as if alive. The floor pulsed beneath their feet, and tiny sparks of light darted across the surface, like fireflies made of crystal. The air vibrated with a hum that resonated deep in their chests, and whispered secrets they could not understand. Shapes moved along the walls as if watching them, every movement, every glance. The children clung to each other, their fingers intertwined for comfort, even as awe threatened to overpower their fear. Towering columns of unknown metal spiraled toward ceilings that disappeared into misty heights. Far above their heads, strange floating platforms drifted silently across the chamber, casting shadows that twisted and bent in impossible ways. And everywhere there were glowing runes and symbols that seemed to shift when looked at directly, like the palace itself was alive and aware of their presence. The children's eyes widened as the Galactic King appeared again, his silhouette framed by the radiant throne that rose higher than the tallest mountain. On Earth the throne glimmered with a light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and the king's robes shimmered with colors that had no names. He moved gracefully, his long fingers trailing through the air, drawing invisible patterns that made the light dance and flicker. The children could feel the power radiating from him, a presence so immense it made their skin tingle with a mixture of fear and fascination. The king spoke, though his voice was not heard but felt deep inside their minds, a low echo that wrapped around their thoughts and made them shiver with anticipation and dread. He gestured toward the palace, and the children felt a compulsion to explore, as if the walls themselves were urging them forward. Hesitantly, they stepped onto a floating platform that drifted smoothly through the palace corridors. Every surface shimmered and reflected strange images, sometimes showing their own faces, sometimes showing distant galaxies and strange creatures moving across alien skies. The children whispered to each other, their voices trembling and echoing strangely as if the palace absorbed sound and returned it. Transformed shadows moved along the edges of their vision, and small beings made of light flickered in and out of existence, giving the children the sensation of being watched but not threatened. At the heart of the palace they found a vast atrium filled with pools of liquid light and staircases that led nowhere, yet always seemed to connect to somewhere new. The hum of the palace grew louder, and the children felt their hearts synchronize with it, as if the building itself was alive, breathing with them, or maybe through them. The king waited silently at the top of the throne, his gaze never leaving them, and the children sensed that every step they took, every thought they had, was known to him already, and they could not decide if that made them afraid or strangely comforted. As they moved deeper into the palace, the children began to notice small signs of familiarity, symbols that reminded them of Earth, faint glimmers of their homes, and fleeting feelings of their families, yet distorted as if seen through a dream. They wondered if this place was only a prison, or perhaps a school, or maybe something even greater, something that would change them forever. And though fear still gripped them, a new spark of curiosity began to grow deep within their hearts, a feeling that even in the heart of the alien palace, they might discover who they truly were. As the children moved further into the palace, the light began to dim in certain corridors, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The hum of the walls grew softer and more urgent, as if the building was breathing around them or whispering secrets they could almost understand but not fully. The shadows stretched across the floor like dark rivers, flowing toward them, curling around corners and slipping along the walls, and the children felt a shiver run down their spines. They clung to each other, gripping hands tightly, as the air grew colder and the faint scent of metallic ozone filled their noses. Every step echoed strangely, bouncing off invisible walls and making them feel both lost and watched. The shadows whispered names in voices that sounded like the wind, and the children turned their heads, but no one was there. Only flickers of shapes in the corners of their eyes that vanished when they tried to focus created the illusion of movement that made their hearts race and their minds question reality. They began to see strange glowing glyphs etched into the walls, symbols that shifted and reformed each time looked at directly, like the palace was testing their attention and perhaps their courage. The whispers seemed to speak directly into their minds, images of distant worlds, stars burning and dying, ships flying through the void, and strange creatures with eyes like mirrors flickered in their thoughts. The children felt fear mixing with wonder as their imaginations struggled to keep pace with the palace around them. And every now and then one of the shadows would pause, as if studying them, or perhaps waiting for them to understand something the children did not yet grasp. They stumbled upon a hallway lined with mirrors that reflected not their faces but scenes from other worlds. Ice mountains, glowing seas, floating islands, and creatures moving in impossible ways. They gasped as the reflections shifted and sometimes showed themselves older, braver, or wielding powers they did not yet know they possessed. The shadows whispered louder, urging them to explore, to listen, and to learn, but also warning them of dangers that lurked just out of sight. Every time they thought they were alone, a soft glow would appear along the edges of the walls, guiding them subtly toward the center of the palace, or away from places that might trap them forever. As night deepened outside the palace, so did the darkness inside, yet it was not threatening, more like a living presence testing their courage and resilience. The children realized that fear was not just something to survive, but a tool to sharpen their senses and teach them to see the hidden truth that lay beneath every wall, every shadow, every echo. The whispers slowly began to take form, showing fleeting visions of their past, their parents, and strange moments they could not remember clearly, but that tugged at something deep in their hearts. As they walked hand in hand, the children began to feel a strange mixture of dread and excitement, wondering what secrets the shadows would reveal next, and if the palace would ever let them leave, or if they were meant to remain in the whispering darkness until they understood the purpose of their abduction. The children awoke on a platform that drifted above a shimmering pool of light, the hum of the palace resonating through their bodies, as if the building itself had become a teacher, and they, its students. The Galactic King stood before them, his eyes glowing faintly with an unspoken promise, and the children felt both fear and curiosity swell in their chests. He motioned and the air around them shifted as if reality itself was bending to his will. Colors warped and flowed like liquid painting. The walls, with images that seemed impossible to exist. The king spoke, though the words were felt, not heard, images and emotions flooding their minds faster than any human could process at first. The children stumbled, struggling to understand the meaning of what they saw, but slowly patterns began to emerge. They were shown how to lift objects without touching them, how to bend the light around them to reveal hidden paths, and how to sense the intentions of others across great distances. At first their attempts failed spectacularly. Books flew uncontrollably, floating away, objects slammed into walls, and lights flickered violently, but the king did not scold or punish. He simply observed, his eyes sharp and knowing, and a soft glow would envelop them each time they tried again, until success arrived and the children gasped at their own power. Each lesson was more difficult than the last, and sometimes terrifying. The children were forced to confront visions of monsters and darkness that seemed to exist in the air around them, yet they were taught to command fear itself, to turn it into focus and strength. Their minds stretched beyond the boundaries of their small human bodies, and they felt themselves expanding, reaching into the depths of the palace and beyond, their hearts racing with excitement and terror. The king introduced them to strange artifacts, glowing orbs and shards of unknown metals that seemed to hum in response to their thoughts, and slowly the children learned to manipulate them, channels of energy bending to their will like water flowing through their fingers. It was exhausting and exhilarating, every failure followed by sudden moments of brilliance that left the children dizzy and amazed. They laughed and cried and sometimes whispered to one another secrets. They could barely understand themselves, discovering strengths they never knew they possessed. The palace itself responded to their growing mastery, lights dancing across walls, staircases adjusting to their movement, and shadows retreating or converging as if testing their skill at every turn. The Galactic King watched silently most of the time, but occasionally he allowed a soft nod or a small smile, and the children realized that approval from him was rarer than fear, and more precious than gold. Nights passed, and days felt meaningless as the children lost track of time, immersed in lessons that seemed impossible to survive. Yet somehow they did survive, and each day became a triumph. The impossible slowly became real, and the children felt a strange thrill knowing that they were being shaped into something greater, something beyond ordinary humans. And even as they grew stronger, they could not forget the hum of the palace, or the way the shadows seemed to watch and whisper, still reminding them that their journey was far from over, and that the greatest lessons were yet to come. The children had begun to notice changes, not just in their abilities but in their feelings toward the Galactic King. When they had first been taken, the very sight of him had filled them with fear, but now they felt something different, a strange and confusing mixture of respect, curiosity, and even a hint of trust. The king had never raised his voice, nor had he harmed them. Instead, he watched with patient eyes as they struggled and learned, guiding them with small gestures that often carried more meaning than words could convey. In the quiet moments between lessons, the children would find themselves speaking to one another in hushed voices about the subtle kindnesses they thought they had seen: a cloak wrapped gently around a sleeping child, a plate of strange but warm food left where they would find it, the flicker of what might have been a smile. When one of them succeeded at a task they had once thought impossible, they began to realize that perhaps he was not only their captor, but also their protector, and maybe even their teacher. The palace itself seemed to respond to this shift. Corridors that once felt cold and alien now felt warmer, lights glowed softly when they passed, and shadows no longer lingered as menacingly. In the corners, sometimes the children would catch the king watching them, not with the calculating gaze of a ruler weighing his prisoners, but with an expression that was almost human, almost gentle. They began to ask him questions through the strange language of thoughts, and though his answers were often brief, they always carried a weight that lingered in their minds long after he had spoken. He told them that they were meant for more than the lives they had known on earth, that their paths were written in the stars long before they were born. The children felt a growing connection to one another as well, their shared experiences weaving them together into something stronger than friendship. They learned to read each other's expressions, to understand one another without speaking, to move as one during the more challenging lessons, and to offer silent encouragement when one faltered. They began to laugh again, in the rare moments when the palace allowed them to be children, climbing the floating platforms or racing each other through the shifting corridors. Their laughter echoed through the halls, And for the first time since their abduction, it did not feel out of place or unwelcome. The Galactic King never joined them yet. He never stopped them either. And once they thought they saw him pause at the edge of the atrium, watching as if the sound of their joy stirred some ancient memory. The bond between captor and captive, between teacher and student, continued to grow, even though none of them could quite understand why it was, as if an invisible thread connected them now, binding their fates together in a way that neither fear nor mistrust could easily sever. And though questions still lingered in their minds, the children began to sense that whatever journey lay ahead, they would not face it as frightened strangers, but as something far more powerful, united by the bond they were only just beginning to understand. The more time the children spent in the palace, the more they began to notice strange patterns, hidden in its walls and floors, symbols that seemed to glow only when they were near. As they passed certain corridors, faint lines of light would trace themselves along the smooth surfaces, forming shapes they almost recognized but could not name at first. They followed these glowing trails whenever they appeared and soon realized they were not random. The patterns seemed to react to them, pulsing brighter when they were close together and fading when they moved apart. The Galactic King never told them what these signs meant, but his eyes would linger on them for a long moment whenever they found a new one. The children began to whisper about the possibility that the palace was showing them something meant only for them. They discovered a room unlike any other, deep within the palace, where the walls were covered in massive carvings of warriors, standing beneath alien skies, their armor shining like the stars themselves. In the center of the room stood a round pedestal, and upon it rested a crystal sphere that pulsed with a heartbeat of light. When they approached it, the sphere came to life, showing visions that made their breath catch. They saw faces not their own, yet somehow familiar, strong and noble eyes that shone with determination, hands that wielded weapons of strange design, voices that spoke in a language they could not understand but that made their hearts race with recognition. The visions shifted to scenes of battles fought in the skies and across worlds, made of ice, fire and endless oceans, and in each scene the mysterious figures fought side by side with the Galactic King. The children did not know how they could feel it, but deep inside they sensed a connection, as if the people in those visions were not strangers at all, but part of their own story. They began to search the palace more carefully now, looking for smaller clues, and found tiny fragments of objects hidden in forgotten corners, a pendant half buried in a wall panel, a scrap of fabric that smelled faintly of salt and wind, a shard of metal etched with the same glowing symbols they had seen before. Each discovery brought a strange rush of warmth and a deep ache of longing, though they could not explain why. The king remained silent as they collected these items, yet there was something in his gaze, a shadow of memory or perhaps sorrow that only deepened their curiosity. The children started to dream at night of people who looked like them but older, of voices calling their names and of hands reaching out to them through a sea of stars. When they woke, the visions clung to them and they began to suspect that these dreams were not dreams at all, but pieces of a truth the palace wanted them to find. And though they did not yet understand it, they knew they were getting closer to something that would change everything. It happened in the great chamber, at the heart of the palace, where the ceiling opened to the endless night sky, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. The Galactic King summoned the children without a word, and they felt the air thrum with an energy unlike anything they had felt before. The floor beneath them shimmered and split into glowing pathways leading toward the throne, which pulsed with a steady golden light. As they approached, the king extended his hand, and the air between them filled with a swirl of light and shadow, forming into images so vivid they felt more like memories than visions. The children saw a younger version of the Galactic King standing beside two men and two women, whose faces made their hearts stop. They did not know these people yet. Something deep inside them screamed that they did. The figures moved with a grace and strength that felt almost unreal, wielding weapons that blazed with starlight and wearing armor etched with the same glowing symbols the children had seen throughout the palace. They fought side by side against monstrous creatures of darkness, their movements perfectly in sync, their determination unshakable in the vision. The Galactic King looked at them not as soldiers but as equals, as friends, as something far deeper. The children could feel the emotion in his gaze. Even across the strange barrier of the vision, the scene shifted, showing the four warriors standing together on a mountaintop beneath alien moons, smiling at one another with a bond forged in battle and unbreakable trust. Then the vision drew closer, focusing on their faces, and the children gasped because they saw pieces of themselves in each. One a smile they had seen in the mirror, a tilt of the head, a shape of the eyes that could not be coincidence. They realized, with a dizzying rush of understanding, that these were their parents, not ordinary people but legendary protectors of worlds, whose names were likely sung in stories across the galaxy. The king let the vision fade, but the truth hung in the air, as heavy as the silence that followed. The children stared at him, their hearts racing, their minds struggling to grasp what this meant. The Galactic King spoke in that strange voice, that was felt rather than heard, telling them that their parents had been the guardians of light, defenders against the darkness that sought to consume the stars. He told them that their parents had once saved his life and the lives of countless others, and that when the time came for them to lay down their weapons, they had entrusted him with their greatest treasures, their children. The abduction was no act of cruelty, he said, but the beginning of their inheritance, the path to the destiny their parents had prepared for them since before they were born. The children felt an overwhelming wave of pride and sorrow crash over them, tears stinging their eyes as they finally understood that they were not just lost children in an alien palace, they were heirs to a legacy greater than anything they had ever imagined, and their journey was only beginning. The revelation had ignited something inside the children, a fire that could not be extinguished by fear or uncertainty. They could not remain silent any longer, and when the Galactic King called them to the throne again, they stepped forward with steady voices and unshaken eyes. The great chamber was alive with the hum of unseen machinery, and the walls glowed faintly as if listening to the words that were about to be spoken. The king looked down upon them, waiting as though he had known this moment would come. The eldest child stepped forward, their small hands clenched tightly at their sides, and demanded to know why the king had hidden the truth for so long, why he had taken them from their home without explanation. The others joined their voice to the challenge, their words tumbling over one another, filled with the weight of longing for parents they barely remembered and the ache of growing up without them. They demanded answers, not as frightened captives but as the rightful heirs of the warriors whose blood ran through their veins. The king listened in silence, his face unreadable, though the air around him seemed to pulse heavier with each word. When they had finished, he rose from the throne, his robes shifting like waves of starlight, and descended the steps toward them. Each footfall echoed with the gravity of the moment. He told them that the truth was not withheld out of malice, but out of necessity, that their parents' enemies still lived and watched, and would have destroyed them had they known their lineage too soon. He explained that the lessons and trials they had endured within the palace were not punishments but preparations, shaping them into protectors, capable of defending not only themselves, but entire worlds. The children did not lower their gaze, and the youngest asked if he trusted them now to face whatever dangers their parents once fought. The king's eyes softened ever so slightly, and he answered that he had trusted them from the beginning, but trust alone could not grant them strength. That was something they had to earn, and they had earned it. The palace around them seemed to respond to his words, the hum deepening into a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a living thing. The floating platforms drifted closer as if to witness the exchange. The children felt the weight of their destinies settle on their shoulders, and though it was heavy, it no longer frightened them. They stood taller, now ready to claim the legacy left to them. The king stepped back, and with a motion of his hand summoned a display of light and stars that formed a map of the galaxy, pinpointing worlds in need of their protection. He told them that when the time came, they would leave the palace and step into the universe as guardians in their own right. Their confrontation had not been an act of rebellion but the final test, and in passing it they had proven themselves worthy. The children exchanged glances, and in that moment they understood that their journey was no longer about returning home. It was about stepping into the roles they were born to fill. The day of departure came without warning. The palace woke them with a brighter light than they had ever seen, its walls pulsing with energy, as if the building itself knew their time within it had come to an end. The Galactic King summoned them to the great chamber where the throne stood bathed in golden radiance, and the air thrummed with a power that made their skin tingle. He told them the final lesson was not about strength or skill but about choice, that they could return to Earth and live as they once had, or they could step fully into the destiny their parents had prepared for them. The children stood together in silence, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down upon them. They thought of the lives they had left behind, the familiar smells of home, the faces of friends they might never see again, but they also thought of the stars they had glimpsed, the worlds they had trained to protect, and the unshakable bond they now shared with one another. And with the king, one by one, they spoke their choice, and each voice carried the same resolve. They would return to Earth, but not to stay. They would go back only to say goodbye to the life they once knew, and then they would return to the stars, to embrace the path ahead. The king nodded solemnly, and with a wave of his hand the palace shifted, the walls melting into rivers of light that flowed into a single beam. Stretching out into the darkness of space, the children stepped into the beam, and felt themselves lifted weightless and unafraid as the palace faded from sight and the familiar blue and green of Earth grew larger below them. They landed in the same quiet village from which they had been taken, the glowing marks from that night still faintly visible on the ground as they walked the streets. Memories returned in waves, the laughter of neighbors, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of the wind through the trees, but it all felt different now, smaller, somehow, compared to what they had seen and learned. The villagers stared in disbelief, some rushing to embrace them with tears and joy, while others whispered in awe at their strange clothing and the faint glow that seemed to cling to their skin. The children stayed only long enough to offer comfort and farewell to those they loved, explaining as best they could that they had a duty far beyond the horizon of Earth. When the time came, they gathered once more in the clearing where the beam had first touched down and looked up to see the Galactic King's ship descending in silence. The hum filled their hearts like a call to adventure, and without hesitation they stepped aboard. The village grew smaller behind them, until it was only a speck against the vastness of space. The king stood before them not as a captor but as an ally, and the children knew the truth of his words. They were no longer simply children, they were heirs of the guardians of light. And from that moment onward their destiny was to protect the galaxy just as their parents had before them.